Hello and welcome everyone to UI Mondays. This is our show where we talk about everything UI related, front of the front end, design, development, really whatever we want, because it's our show, not yours. Today, though, we have a really great episode lined up. I have with me here Elaina.
Hi.
I will always do it. Twitch flips the camera and it throws me every single
time.
time.
It is weird.
Gesture. I guess it's really that it doesn't flip the camera and everything else does. But regardless, I will eternally point in the wrong direction. Lena is here with us, author of the article Tailwind and the Femininity of CSS. That is what we are here to talk about today. It's going to be a really great show, a really great discussion. So I'm glad you guys are here. So to kick us off, Lena, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm so happy to be here. This is really exciting. I've never done a stream before, so this is fun. But yeah, hi, I'm Elaina, and I make things for the internet. But
I love that. I want to steal that.
I feel like that's usually what I tell my family what I do, because the explanation of what I do gets a little bit more complex, and so I'm just like, yeah, I make websites and things. I don't know. But yeah, I'm a senior product designer and team lead at a consultancy company called ThoughtBot. They're pretty well known in the Rails world, but we do like a lot of work outside of that language now. And we also have an amazing design team that does like really stellar product work. They're great, love them all. So for me specifically, my work varies from client to client, but in general, as a designer, I'm wearing a lot of hats. So I'm doing project manager, user researcher, prototyper, wireframer, visual designer, and front-end developer. And so
it is a lot of hats.
yeah, but it is fun. I'm not doing every single thing for every project. It kind of just depends on like the client needs and the life cycle of the product and like the product itself, all that kind of stuff. So but it's great. It's really fun. I think it's partially about delivering a thing, but a lot of it is like delivering a process, which is really rewarding, I think.
That's a really good way to think about it. I really like that. I'll interrupt just real quick. We had a couple chats. Shows your Twitch channel. You're watching Code It Live. I think it was really in our countdown. You might have missed it. So welcome to Code It Live. There's a whole bunch of shows that happen here, all from the Kendo and Telerik family. You're currently watching UI Mondays, where we talk about front of the front end, user interface design, user experience, CSS, whatever we want. But today's topic specifically, we are interviewing Elaina here, who has written a fantastic article that we will mostly be talking about. She wrote Tailwind and the Femininity of CSS, which actually, let me get a link to that real quick. And I will throw it in the chat because it is well worth a read.
Thanks.
As a matter of fact, actually, I'm cracking up at this because we discovered only after we met that she used to work for Telerik, which is a part of Progress, and has since moved on to other opportunities. So quite the contrary, we already successfully recruited her once. Maybe we can do it again.
You never know. Yeah, it's a small world. It's weird. There's so much overlap.
Such a small world feeling when you're like, oh, by the way, I used to work there.
It's a while ago, like a decade before Telerik was acquired. But yeah, so funny.
Yeah, and an important follow-up question: why are you so cool?
I don't know. I think I know who this is, and I'm like, I don't know. I just am. It's just a feel. I'm just born with it.
But no, as it turns out, we have a few things in common, not just working at some point at different points in time for the same company. But also both of us have kind of shifted from graphic design based careers into more development focused careers. And I'm always really excited and really thrilled to talk to people that have done that same kind of weird shift and that live in that kind of space where design and development overlap. I'm interested in hearing kind of what brought you there, making that shift, what that kind of journey was like for you, because it was definitely for me an interesting one.
Yeah, I kind of fell here by accident, and I feel like that's like the story for a
Yeah.
lot of people. I hear really like weird tales of like how people got to like, doing front end design and product design and or just even development in general. Like not everyone sort of starts off with like this very traditional path of like computer science or whatever and like landing a job at a tech company. Like a lot of it just like they happen to fall into. I think this is like especially true for a lot of people who started their career maybe like a little bit before like the tech boom of like, like really like, heavy front end designers or back end design and back end developers and having a lot of those like distinct job titles. You kind of like,
Yes.
you just like happened to be at a job that did both design and development and you ended up liking the development part. And so you sought that out more. But yeah, that's sort of how I fell into it. So I started off my career in print design and publishing, like doing little bits of web work along the way. And then Polaric was actually my first job where I was doing like a good amount of front end work and I learned like a lot in that, like, I was only there for like a little bit less than a year, but I learned a ton. And then after that, I landed a job at the Boston Globe newspaper as a product designer, which is like a very small team that they had there. This was after they had launched their responsive website, which is like a huge thing in like the responsive web design world. It was really cool. So I was working sort of like within that space. And then throughout my career at the Boston Globe, I joined like a team, or we had like sort of started a team, like the storytelling team, which was like, we were like a little boutique development shop embedded in the newsroom. So we would consult journalists to create like different web experiences to like tell stories in new ways. So that'd be like data visualization, immersive multimedia experiences, games, like any kind of fun and new web experimentations.
That's
like,
really cool. I've seen some of those that will like kind of take you through a story as you scroll, and like
it's so fun.
So fun.
I think like it was like it's a really unique opportunity to like really just experiment with whatever kind of thing you want to learn, because like a lot of these stories have like such quick turnarounds and they just want to get something out. Like you just do it and hope it sticks. So it was a lot of like quick and dirty code work. We always called it like hard code, hard news was our motto there. But yeah, I think like you had to like, I had a lot of creative license to like build both like my design skills and also like development stuff. And then after that, I ended up at ThoughtBot. And so I've been learning even more ever since. And that is my journey, my career journey. But if you take a few steps before that, before I even started my career, I've always been interested in making designs for the web and layouts, because I started out like customizing my LiveJournal and my MySpace, like any good millennial.
Me too. I am always thrilled and relieved when I say LiveJournal and someone else knows what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
I've just realized we've crested like that age, and occasionally I say it and I get like a blank stare in return. I'm like, oh no, you and me, we're not the same.
Yeah, I was really upset to find that I must have like deleted mine in a fit of teen angst. And so I don't have access to it anymore.
I'm relieved mine is gone. No, I was telling someone the other day, that was some of the earliest of my freelance work, was I would design banners and icons for LiveJournal communities back in the day.
That's amazing. That is amazing.
Get paid whole tens or 15s of dollars to do so.
It's good money. Awesome. I love doing that. Yeah, I did that for like a lot of my friends. Like I would be like, customizing their life. They would be spending free period customizing LiveJournal pages for friends. And I would be like, instead of doing my homework.
The absolute grip that site had on us.
I know, right? Right?
Constantly on LJ.
But pretty much, like you would have your groups, and like, I would always like try to find like my crushes LiveJournal, because I just wanted to read, and then I would write my secret posts about how I was like in love with them.
See, unfortunately, mine is much less cool because I was one of those unfortunate like anime kids, and that was my whole.
Amazing, I love it.
I say that like I'm still not, but
It sticks with you for life, I think. Yeah,
you don't ever
once an anime kid, always an anime kid.
You don't ever get to escape that. I think it's still with you, just a little bit forever.
Mm-hmm.
Couple hellos in the chat from Madagascar. Hello,
Hi.
I'm glad you're with us. So one of the other things that we really have in common is this love for CSS, as I've kind of learned. And about a month ago, you published this great blog, which I've linked here, called Tailwind and the Femininity of CSS, which quickly made the rounds through at least my Twitter feed, was getting shared, I think, by everyone and quickly blowing up, and for good reason. I found it to be a really thought-provoking, a really insightful look at the way CSS is really viewed in the development community. So for any of our listeners, I know we had a couple questions, who haven't had the chance to read your article yet. Could you give us kind of a quick overview before we dive a little deeper in some questions?
Yeah, sure. I think like maybe like the TLDR is don't use Tailwind. No, you can use Tailwind. That's not my thesis. The real summary is that like tools like Tailwind are totally fine in many cases, but like the idea that like CSS frameworks are often shunted into projects as a cure-all for good layout, design, structure, systems. And so front-end languages like CSS and HTML aren't seen as valuable to a lot of developers and less development teams, and that they should be focusing their time on learning real frameworks like Rails or React or Elm or whatever. And then CSS is just about making things look pretty, and therefore it kind of has this perceived notion of being fun in a world of very masculine programming languages. And so because of that, it's like not legitimate and not worth learning more or investing in a developer who is actually skilled in that area.
Was there like a specific experience or a situation that kind of prompted this blog? I imagine it had something to do with having to work with Tailwind. if I had to guess, but I could be wrong.
Yes. So sort of, like definitely sort of. And like I also want to reiterate that I do work on projects that use Tailwind, and it's fine, and I'm fine with it. It's not like I'm not like ecstatic about it, but I do it, and I work with designers who love Tailwind and who write about Tailwind, and it's great, and I think that's great for them. I support that.
This is a totally fine place to have tech hot takes. Like you don't have to dampen that down for you.
Oh yeah, I know. I just like I don't think you're a bad person for using Tailwind is what I want to get at there. So first I want to note that like I'm not the first person to point out a lot of these ideas at all. I linked a lot of them in my article, but so someone like Cher Scarlett, for example, wrote a great article about sort of the bandwagon attacks from Tailwind evangelists on Sarah Sueydine, who's like a very well-known designer and developer and educator in the web world. Like she had just like agreed with another person's article on the critique of Tailwind, and then like the sheer amount of bullying and just overall abuse directed at her for agreeing with someone's fairly benign critique of a tool was disgusting. It was awful. And so she went on to talk about like racism and sexism that's rooted in that attack. And so this is something that's not new. And there's also like been many articles written about CSS and HTML and front end in general, being considered just making things look pretty and not real development work. And so when these same developers are complaining how CSS is so hard, like I can't even center a div, and like I can show you if you just take the time to learn.
That one in particular drives me so crazy because in modern CSS you can literally center a div in like two or three lines of code. It's so easy now.
So easy. It just doesn't work with the same paradigms that you're used to, and that's the thing. So anyways, like this actually came up during like a work hackathon where we were implementing like dark mode on an internal tool, and it turns out that tool uses a lot of Tailwind, and I wanted to yank it out to use custom properties. And then that ended up like in a discussion with other designers on my team who love Tailwind, and we were just talking about like my feelings on it, my hot take, and like my reservations about the community and all that kind of stuff. And then I used my hackathon time to write this article, and that's that's the long and short of it.
It is interesting because I think like the kind of idea of like framework wars or like people that are passionate about certain development tools is nothing new and definitely seems common, but there's so much, you're right, that it's a much more like visceral, angry reaction when it comes to things around Tailwind and really around CSS in general. It seems to provoke this higher, like more extreme kind of reaction.
Yeah, it feels like it's kind of like if like people take it as an affront on like legitimizing it makes it like, you know, makes their knowledge base of other languages like less legitimate or seem less, I don't know, important. I'm not sure how legitimizing CSS and HTML in front of the front end stuff makes like other languages less worthy or less worthwhile or anything like that.
Right. No, and I mean, I agree. And I think that's why I found a lot of value and I thought this was such an interesting take. Because again, you kind of see like, you know, there's Angular fanboys and React fanboys. And like, I will be the first one to joke about React superiority because it's what I like to code with.
That's great. Yeah.
But like always with kind of a like, you know, wink, wink kind of thing. Because they're all just tools. I worked in Angular for years and it was fine too, you know?
Yep.
They're all just different tools we have in our toolbox to solve different problems.
Exactly.
But we do see so much more of a hang up around CSS and around HTML. And there does seem to be something like they're not good enough or they're not, I don't know, they're not real coding enough.
Right.
I think a lot of that is tied up, as you pointed out, in this kind of perception of femininity, which is interesting because we do also see some demographic shift in the people that use it. We did the State of CSS survey on UI Mondays, I guess 2 weeks ago, because I've lost all meaning of time in the pandemic. But and we see that there's a significantly higher percentage of women that fill out that survey reflecting the state of CSS than that fill out the similar state of JavaScript survey. Usually a difference of several percentage points. Still, which seems silly when we're talking about something that's still vastly majority male.
Like, oh yeah, you look at the demographics there, and it's pretty much like entirely like white men who at least are like were respondents on that kind of survey.
Right.
Which I know like is.
Yeah, we don't know for sure because we only have people that respond to the survey, you know, right. And so that has some implicit bias already of being mostly English speaking. Some of that, which doesn't quite get everyone. And of course, it's all shared usually through social media. So it depends on where you're present and, you know, are you on quote unquote tech Twitter or not?
Right.
But that being said, I think there's not a much better source. We're working with what we've got.
Right.
Some interesting conversation in the chat about SQL and about the perceptions of SQL as a feminine language and whether CSS is
SQL.
Which I gotta tell you, I'm not super familiar. I have never worked in SQL and was unaware of that kind of perception of it as a feminine language. I haven't either. Interesting. Yeah, tell us more, Boss Fighter. I'm intrigued. But speaking of Twitter and tech Twitter, I'm curious what kind of reactions you got for this blog. You kind of posted it with this acknowledgement, like maybe I'm stirring the pot, but here's my hot take.
Yeah,
I think it was worth it, but I'm interested to hear whether it stirred the pot as much as you thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reaction was generally pretty positive, which was great. Awesome. Like I didn't get any death threats and DMs, which is a win, I suppose. Yes. Yeah. But like, I mean, it definitely landed in like Hacker News and Reddit, which surfaced some like not so savory commentary. But Like it was like minimal conversation there. So like whatever. But in general, like I received a lot of supportive replies on Twitter and elsewhere. And I actually got a message on Instagram from a former client of mine saying they were discussing my article in their work Slack, and it sparked some really great conversation on their development team. And like that felt
That's
like
so
really
cool.
nice. Like I was like, oh, like great, I'm so happy. That's all I wanted, is like for people to kind of like talk about it a little bit more and to surface some of these issues, and also just to vent my own frustrations.
That's what the internet is for. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt good that people sort of, there's a lot of like agreement there, and there was, it was sparking some interesting discussions about sort of like this divide and what is seen as worthy in web development, and how we like talking about it like in terms of like the full stack developer, and like that CSS is not necessarily a part of that, or like deep knowledge of that. It's not involved in like many promotion skills. Like you don't have to know it. It's sort of like a thing like you're just expected to pick up, I think. And you don't have to know too much about it.
Which I think contributes to a lot of people's frustration with it too, because we've created this idea of like, oh, it's so easy, you just pick it up and it's nothing,
Yep.
And then when you get in there and it's not nothing, and there's things that are really hard, there's this feeling of like, just differing expectations, where you thought you'd come in and something was a breeze, and then it was harder than you thought it would be.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting questions going on in the chat that I want to highlight. One, I think, is probably one that you saw as comments elsewhere, because this is a pretty common take, I think. Like, SQL as a language has no gender, like every other programming language. I'm curious what your thoughts on that is. Yeah, and kind of he follows it, or they follow it. Why do we need to apply genders to languages? I don't think that's quite what we're doing here. And not so much talking about the fact that the language itself has a gender, so much as there is a gendered association.
Right.
But I'll let you take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like with any sort of job or area where we don't value it as much, or there's like a lot more gender minoritized people that take up that role, more so than other roles. Like being a teacher is not gendered, but it doesn't have a gender, but like, we very much gender it, and we don't invest in it as much as we should. We don't pay people as much as we should. And the same things comes with like languages of like femininity and masculinity are just concepts.
Right.
You can be yeah, you can be a woman and be more masculine. You can be a man and you can be more feminine. You can be non-binary and be either. You can be whatever. But it's like the idea of like, there are a lot of more non-men in this area than other areas, and it is the one area where we're saying you shouldn't get paid as much as other programmers, and your language is not a programming language, and it's not worth like digging into. You should dig into other languages to be seen as like a really legitimate developer, and that's sort of like the case that we're making in it, is that the femininity is sort of a concept that's applied based on who's doing the work and how we value it.
No, I think that's this idea of like women's work, right, that we've kind of heard about for ages. And for a long time, we think about women's work as being like work in the house, raising of children, or the keeping of house, or the, preparing.
It was hard work.
Which is hard stuff to do. Like, and again, it's not assigning it yet. There's this perception that things that are women's work are less valuable in some way. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're easy, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're valueless. As someone who has learned that I have to prepare 3 meals for myself every day, no matter what, it seems unfair. And also, as a woman, says should not be women's work.
No. Yeah, I had a right before the pandemic started, I gave birth to my first child, and I stayed home with her for 6 months. Thank you. It was so hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Taking care of kids is hard. I mean, I didn't go into it thinking it was easy, but it was like way harder than I thought. And I commend people, the parent, any parent who stays at home with a kid, like it's a lot of work and you should get paid to do it.
Huge. And especially during the pandemic, support systems that were kind of taken for granted are no longer available to us. Again, it was never easy, but especially now is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
There's a lot happening in the chat. I'm gonna try and catch us up. I wanna address all of them. This one I think really sums up a lot of what we were talking about women's work. The idea that SQL is a secretary language.
Oh, that's really interesting. Wow.
So I think that's interesting because I think we see a lot of that same kind of rug sweep with CSS. And I really like that when you were like, is CSS the new SQL? And we were all like, what does that mean? And now we're like, yes.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, this idea that like, oh, it's quick. You can pick it up unless you don't need to do anything complex with CSS.
Right. It's more of like the icing on the cake more so than like, something that's like deep and complex.
Right.
I think that like I had noted somewhere, I can't remember it's in my article, but like Jeremy Keefe had written an article about CSS being simple but not easy. Like it is easy to pick up. Like it's pretty straightforward. It's like kind of written in like a human centric way, but it's like complex in really unexpected ways. And like for that reason, like many people get frustrated and put that fault in the language instead of like shifting their preconceived notions about like how programming should work. And like this is like the most dunked on language.
It really is.
Which is hilarious. And like I totally join in on it. Like it's funny, but like, and CSS frustrates me too. Like I get annoyed with a lot of the things not working the way I expect it to. But you can unlock so much if you just like dig in a little bit more, do a little bit of searching, do the same thing, like read through the docs like you do with any language or framework or whatever. Like I feel like some of these engineers are still using CSS standards from like a decade ago when it's like evolved so much and it's continuing to evolve. Like it's so cool now.
We are really I would almost call it a golden era of CSS. We are seeing so much new stuff that's happening, especially around the grid. We're seeing new stuff around colors. We've got like cascade layers and stuff coming soon.
So excited for layers.
Things are looking really, really good for CSS. And if you haven't used it in really even like 5 years or so, there's been a huge amount of shift, I would say proportionally more than other languages. There's certainly been big shifts in JavaScript. Probably, I mean, we see them in like bigger chunks. You see like the ES6 kind of jump.
Yeah.
But CSS doesn't have that same, there hasn't been that same kind of demarcated release in the same way.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, I don't feel like that was the right way to put it, but like that idea of like, here's a whole new thing. CSS just keeps sliding features under the rug.
Well, yeah, it iterates. And like the cool thing about it is like you can kind of read up where it is. Like, I mean, I think a lot of those, you can kind of see what's sort of in development and you can play around with it too. Like there's a bunch of feature flags if you use like Chrome Canary or like Firefox Nightly or whatever you're using. Like you can use some of these tools in advance and see what's coming down the line. I mean, obviously that like the syntax might change a little bit or things might adjust a bit more once it gets kind of pulled into all the browsers, but being able to play around with stuff early, it's so fun. It's so cool. It's exciting.
It's really fun. I took a deeper dive into like the new color rendering methods and like P3 color stuff recently, and I am so hyped. Like every stream I'm on, I'm like, let's talk about colors. I was so thrilled.
Yeah, it is cool. Well, it's interesting just to see how powerful CSS has become. Like I think a lot of the things that we relied to sort of fill in the gaps for us with JavaScript or like another framework or whatever, like CSS just does on its own natively. Like there might be a point, like I'm a pretty heavy user of Sass on my projects.
That gap is closing so fast.
Yeah, it's so much. Like I cannot wait until I don't have to use any sort of pre-compiler. Like if I can just use native CSS, right, I'm all for that. Like, let's edge towards that. That sounds great.
Yes. More stuff in the chat. Talking about some gender association and the idea of gatekeeping.
Gatekeeping.
Certain languages.
Absolutely.
Which I think is a really good point. Because I think especially women and people of color experience a lot of gatekeeping when attempting to break into computer science related fields, especially those who did not have a formal education, who might not be coming with a computer sciences degree. Can fight that especially hard. And I think it reinforces a lot of those kind of things that we were talking about, that idea of like, whether things are valuable or worth learning and things that you can access. I think that might also be part of it, is that HTML and CSS, you can build a website with just HTML and CSS, right? So they tend to be some of the first things that you learn. That doesn't mean that they're basic. They just are the first things that you need to learn to understand the DOM and structure.
Exactly, which is great. That's why they're the building blocks.
Right.
Was it Frank Kimmerow who had written an article like Everything Easy is Hard Again? I think that's what it's called. But it was kind of going into like how, like, you know, diving back into web development after a while away, and like how everything is like so complex now. And sometimes it needs to be, but sometimes like you don't necessarily need like Rails and Webpacker and like all this other stuff to run like a portfolio page, but like it gets over complex because that's just sort of the paradigm that we're used to when it comes to web development, when you can make things so simple with just HTML and CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript if you need a little bit more pizzazz, but you don't need much. And if you know those foundations, I think you can build off of that knowledge into like creating something even more complex. But having that foundational knowledge, I think, is really important to sort of understanding the inner workings of like how the web works and how pages render, and also like what are the trade-offs when it comes to performance. How can we pull a lot of this back to the simplest form so we can make this web page like load really quickly, because that is impacted in terms of like, are your users going to be like upset that this page is going to take a long while? Do you have like a demographic that needs to access this on their phone and they might not have like good reception there? Like you need to kind of think about all these pieces when you're developing a web page, and having that foundational knowledge can aid in that.
Definitely. I'm going to pull up another one, which I thought was a really good question. BM Krish asks, can I ask a question? During my internship, I did a lot of pair coding, but now I feel like I'm dependent on that. Like I code better and faster when I code with someone. I think this is a really interesting thing because I feel like that's phrased as though it's a bad thing. Like
it's not. I love pairing. I learn faster.
I think this idea that we all need to be like individual, like whatever hacking machines in a dark room is outdated.
And I think I've made like my most major leaps in learning when I'm pairing with someone, and that at my current job, like pairing is like a really, really, really big part of how we kind of create code. And like no one's really expected to kind of just go in the depths and just do it on your own. Like I think pairing uncovers a lot of learning. It's not necessarily a relationship where it's like the mentor and the mentee. It's usually just like this conversation and this flow of information, and it's about solving a problem. And oftentimes it's easier to solve a problem if you have other brains.
Humans are social creatures. We're meant to work together to accomplish goals. And this idea that we all need to be like super individual, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing is just contrary to, I think, how we're meant to function. So I think it's okay. I think it's great that you code better and faster when you code with someone. I think do it as much as you can.
Absolutely. Do more of it. Pair with other people. Offer to pair with other people. Like do some office hours and pair with other people and teach them what you know. Like that's great. Do more of it. We should just all pair all the time.
All the time here, I'll get on stream and work on stuff and have people in the comments be like, no, or like, try this, or like whatever. It's like pairing with 20 people at once.
That's great.
And I actually really love it.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there are some interesting replies here about, you know, do you need to learn to operate on your own? I think that's true that there's a difference between mutual benefit and kind of a one-way dependency. But I think in general, once you kind of get the basics down, a lot of that will come if you are, I'm assuming you're new because you said internship. So correct me if that is a wrong assumption. But I think when you're new, especially, you're still learning so many of that foundation. You're kind of learning how to think. You're learning how to think like a programmer and how to approach problems and like pick them apart. And that is not something that you can Google. You know, like you can always Google syntax, and you can always Google, you know, pieces of code, and you can ask questions on Stack Overflow, and very, very few of those places will tell you how to approach computer science problems. I think that's what we get most when we pair.
Yep. Yeah, I think one of the things that developers, like good developers, are good at, like a sign of a good developer is you know how to ask good questions.
Yes.
Because like I don't know most of the stuff off the top of my head. I Google stuff literally every day.
Oh, constantly.
Like, I don't remember grid syntax. I don't know. Like I don't have it just in my mind brain. Like your skill is building up, asking the right questions and diving into how you might solve that problem. So, this would probably be in the docs, or maybe I should ask someone, or maybe if I work through this problem, or if I look at this, like, you know, this other example, like I can kind of figure it out here. Like knowing where to look is the skill that you can hone, and you can do that with pair programming. You can do that with like by talking to another person, because all it is a conversation about how to solve a problem.
I really liked this recommendation as well, documenting the learning experience so that you don't repeat it in the future, as well as sharing what you've learned. Because that's, I think a lot of people, when they first start like blogging or sharing content, have this feeling that like it has to be super technical or it has to be super advanced, but everybody was once where you are, and there's always a new group of people that are learning at the same time. Yeah. So documenting that experience not only saves you from having to do it again in the future, it also maybe teaches someone else. And if you still can't solve it and you want to go to someone and ask a question, you can ask a really kind of an intelligent, grounded question by being like, I tried this, or I thought about this and it didn't work out that way. Mm-hmm. Why? You know?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people, at least like this is how I felt sort of in the beginning of my career, is like, oh, like everyone's already written about this, or someone else has already said something about this. Like your voice has something to offer in this. Like you are a new person, you have fresh eyes, you're thinking about it from a different angle. Like just write about it, put it out there. Having that source of information for other people is so valuable, and writing it out yourself, I think, like helps uncover some of like the whys and sort of like the interesting nuances of like how you came to approach this problem.
Yep. I say like the best way to learn is to teach, and that has always been my experience.
Yeah, totally.
It's super true. Let's see. What else is happening in the chat? Someone bidding goodbye to SAS. Soon, getting native variables in CSS was like,
custom properties is my favorite. Though I mean, I love SAS. It's been amazing.
I love SAS
also. A great tool. Like it's been
I'm
so
still
powerful.
Using SAS. Full disclosure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Same here. And I think it's so powerful. And has built up so much when it comes to like CSS. Like it's such a solid foundation for better implementing like drier code, friendlier code, scalable code. But I love that native CSS is inching more towards maybe making that more obsolete, or maybe SAS will like, integrate some new things that we just don't have in CSS, and that'll be sort of like a continual thing where like CSS catches up, and these other things like pile on more features that like maybe we want to integrate to CSS later on.
As soon as we get native nesting, it's all over.
I know, right?
Oh man. It was a really good conversation in the chat, but I am going to jump us back over to some femininity and CSS questions. I mean that in all sincerity though, chat, like keep on keeping on. We're here to answer questions. We're here to talk about CSS. It doesn't always have to be 100% related. If something pops into your brain, let's hear about it. That's the fun part of streaming. And actually there was a comment way back in the chat that I didn't highlight then, but think I will now if I can find it. Someone was talking about, there we go, click, that you can solve FizzBuzz in CSS, which leads into actually one of the questions that I wanted to raise with you, which was, in the blog, you mentioned that kind of long-standing, like, CSS isn't a real programming language argument that every 5 to 6 months, like clockwork, makes its way around the internet, along with the, like, should designers code kinds of questions and, like, tabs or spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think this is an argument that's actually worth resolving or having? Or do you think it is more of that, like, tabs versus spaces kind of conversation where everyone has an opinion, but the right answer doesn't actually matter?
Right. Well, so I have actually seen healthy debates on this topic, and I can like understand both points made by each side. And I still stand in the camp that CSS is like a programming language. It's Turing complete. It has functions. It has algorithmic expressions. There's like a billion other examples that other people have written about. And I fully endorse that side of it. That said, I think the debate can continue on without a resolution. That's fine. Like the more, I think the important bit is not whether it's a programming language or not, but its legitimacy within the programming world. Like if the general consensus among engineers was already that CSS is amazing and everyone should learn it and it should be part of your skill set as a full stack developer, then this debate would be so much more benign than it is. Like
Right.
I just like I think I said this before, but like why is it such an affront on your job if we prove that CSS is a programming language? Like why does it make you so mad?
Right. What does it matter?
how does that change anything for you as like a programmer? It doesn't.
Kind of moving from that, I'm curious if you have any kind of theories about why CSS is so polarizing in that way. We've touched on it just a little bit, but just to kind of really like, all right, why do we think some people get so riled about CSS?
Oh my God. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, who truly knows why people get upset over like the silliest things? But I like personally, I feel like it's rooted in a couple of things. Like I think part of it is its output, and then the second part is its paradigms. So at the surface level, CSS is just about making things look pretty. Like that's what we know if we sort of just dive into it. So I feel like that's like a commentary on design as a whole. Like my job in print was like seen as like, oh, you make things look good.
That is, I think, the fastest way to make a developer or to make a designer angry.
Yeah, and it's like, dude, I like studied typography and like Bauhaus and all this stuff for years. Like this doesn't just like come out of my brain naturally. Like this is a skill set I did.
It was really interesting just branching off that because we had a comment on Dev by Design this morning. We were talking about colors, and right at the end of the session, we got rated by another group. So we got a bunch of people in from a C# stream that got dumped into Dev by Design, which was cool. It was really, it was sweet of them to rate us, but also meant that we had a bunch of developers in a design podcast, like all of a sudden. And someone in the comments was like, why does it matter? I'm trying to remember exactly how they phrased it, because we were talking about like the design of applications and why colors matter in terms of like communicating intent. And so that and talking about like why like a bank might use like dark blues and like some more like formal kinds of colors that would support and kind of give this idea of like trustworthiness and like tradition and like dependability. And someone was like, all I care about in my banking app is that it works and it's secure. And it was like, interesting.
Yeah. But where's that feeling of security come from?
Exactly. So we kind of dove into that. It was like, well, what got you to download that app? Like, what made you choose that bank? Like,
yeah.
So this idea of design being like just making it look cute is one that has always driven me personally a little batty.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's super complex. And like, I mean, I went into design thinking like, oh, I'm like good at art and I like code and maybe I like things good. And I like learned how complex it is. I think so. Something like I learned while studying design is that good design is invisible. I think that's like part of like the pedagogy of design is like, so it should be something that's like so natural that your audience doesn't even realize that like all this mountain of thought that went into that design. And you have to make something that a human can like easily understand within the context of an environment. Like a designer's job is usually to like ease the friction between a human and an interaction. And CSS provides like that layer of design for that interaction. It's about systems, it's about product thinking, it's about messaging. It's like the culmination of so many decisions. And that can make or break someone's experience with a website. It has so much power. And if you're only looking at it from the surface level, it's just icing. And why bother whipping up your own like ice?
Right.
I don't know. We're gonna go with that analogy.
I don't know,
like,
but
when you could just go to the corner store. And like, that's not to say like corner store icing is really good. I eat it right out of the can. It's great. But it's not always appropriate in every situation. Especially if you're making like something very custom and that like requires like a lot of care.
Yeah. No, I think that was actually a really good analogy. Yeah, you could go to the store and you could probably get any like 4 or 5 basic icing flavors from the store, right? You could probably get strawberry or chocolate or vanilla or like, something else maybe. But if you want custom icing, if you want icing in the right color, in like the exact shade of pink that you had imagined, if you want icing that tastes like whatever, that's infused with fresh fruit, or you want icing,
if you want to add some
like
ganache
champagne.
to it, if you want to like
right, there are more flavors than the 3 that you can buy at the supermarket.
Now I really want cake, so
yeah, oh god, right. Yeah, we can't handle CSS's power.
True. Can't handle it.
Man.
But yeah, I think so. The other part of that question you had asked, like, why is it so polarizing? I think is the paradigms, and I talked about this a little bit before, but like about CSS being simple but not easy. Like that Jeremy Keith article, like it's easy to pick up, but it's not. It's like super complex. Like you have to dig into it to kind of like figure out how that should work, and like it's been evolving so much, and there's so much to catch up with, and like a lot of the times, like when I'm working with other engineers on my team, we're talking about like grid and flexbox and like, oh my god, I didn't realize you could do this with all this stuff. Like it's like it's so cool, and it's really cool to kind of like pull that knowledge and like empower people to be able to make their own layouts and use it and like customize their own stuff, and like just like giving them those like little nuggets along the way is amazing. But like all it takes is like a little bit of a digging, like a little bit more pushing past that like initial frustration.
Yep. Oh yeah. Again, kind of when we were talking earlier about how much CSS has changed, I feel like grid and flexbox are 2 of the ways that it has been completely revolutionized. Maybe since the last time folks touched CSS, and it is so powerful.
Yeah, CSS Zen Garden had no idea what was coming down the line.
Oh man, all those years when we were like using bootstrap columns and stuff, like CSS grid was coming for us. We just needed to hold on just a little longer.
It was there.
Good question in the chat. Says this all seems to be in the category of design as a response to some needs or problems, be it visual communication, emotional experiences, interactions. What do you think about design as the driver of innovation?
Yeah.
I'll leave that one up because that was a long one.
Yeah, I mean, like as a product designer, I'm coming with like problems, and for clients, like a lot of the times, like we're walking back from solutions. And like, how can we design around this problem? But yeah, I think like there's some like interesting notion of like how can like design be the basis of that innovation? I don't know. I think that's coming up with your own problems and trying to assess what that human need is. I think as much as like design is the driver of innovation, there is always this nugget of problem solving at some core thing. And it might not be a problem that is like current, it might be like a future problem, but there is some kind of like human need somewhere in there, whether it's something that you realize at the beginning or later down the line. Because you might just like create something for the sake of creation, for the sake of design, and find out that it actually does solve a human need. Or you might iterate it on it later. Like you might create something that is designed for one thing, and that a human need sort of shifts that focus later on. I don't know if that answers that question, but
no, I think that's interesting. And that's one of those places where for me, that's where I would probably draw the line between what is art and what is design.
Yeah.
Is that when you're talking about, design, quote unquote, as the driver of innovation, I would say that's art. And I think that's okay. That's not in like trying to take it down a peg or anything. I think both are equally valuable but different, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that art helps us push the boundaries of how we approach problems because it paves the way for us to look at things later. We often see trends kind of, for those of us that are either fortunate or unfortunate enough to have taken semesters of art history, we'll see trends happen in art, and then shortly afterwards we'll see similar trends happen in design as they get kind of commercialized, probably isn't the right word, but kind of adapted for public consumption in that kind of way.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's inherently bad. I think a lot of times we think of that maybe like as kind of gross, like something happens naturally and then it becomes like corporatized or something. It doesn't always happen that way, though.
I think it's just a natural thing. Yeah, like the ubiquity just sort of happens, and I think that's like an interesting thing of like, you know, like if you're pulling from like real life or print or art or whatever to like make your like web, I think that's awesome. Like that's like a great inspiration source.
Yeah. I think art is there for that kind of like art for art's sake and trying to create things just to see what you can do and push boundaries and try new things. And then once we figure out the use case, then we can use it in design to solve problems. And that's awesome.
And there's like, I think there's like a lot of opportunities in like creative coding and what that looks like. Like you look at like Lin Fisher's work, for example, like a single div, which is like, the sheer amazingness. Cool. I can't even fathom how she does all of these. They're ridiculous. They're so cool. But yeah, it's like this really cool exercise in creativity. And I mean, there is a problem solving aspect to it, of like how might I make this piece of art with just a single div and like a lot of box shadows. But it's just cool to watch, and I love seeing. I think that also drives innovation as well. It's like, oh, I had no idea that code could do this, like, because you can take a lot of those like pieces of art and apply it to real life problems. Of like, oh, like I didn't know like I could do all of these things. Like here's some like nuggets I want to pull from that will be helpful in solving like this like problem that I want to achieve in code.
It might not have solved, you might not have been doing it to solve a problem, but it might solve somebody else's problem.
Yeah, that absolutely. Yeah, creative coding is really cool. I encourage more people to kind of just wiggle around in it and just like try something out for the sake of trying it out and not necessarily like looking to solve a problem. They just want to see if something works to make something cool.
Oh man. So kind of similar. We talked a little bit earlier about that idea of how front-end work has shifted, especially kind of the idea of like a full stack developer that's meant to know everything there is to know, which I think is frankly unrealistic. That's probably a whole nother stream. But especially front-end work, we've seen a huge shift from being primarily HTML and CSS focused to, well, you need just a little bit of JavaScript for interactivity to, well, actually, we have these JavaScript frameworks now. You should really learn jQuery to, well, actually, has anyone told you about our Lord and Savior Vue? And all of that shift has come with a whole bunch of tools, right? And like that includes all of the frameworks. It includes like NPM and managing libraries and huge shifts. And also, I would say Tailwind, which obviously we called out specifically, but I would very much group Tailwind in that same category.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these tools are great.
Yeah, I think they are as well. But I'd also say that a chunk of them are JavaScript focused, right? Definitely. A lot of them were kind of made by and for people that were more working in what used to be the back end and is now kind of creeping its way forward. And because of that, there's a lot of discomfort around working with CSS. And a lot of those tools kind of mask the experience of working with CSS because it wasn't something and still isn't something that's in the natural skill set of a backend developer, which again, I think is okay. I don't think everyone's meant to know everything.
Yeah.
But as we're seeing that shift, we're seeing CSS and HTML get left behind a little bit. Or like we have to use them, but only because we have to use them. If we could not use them, we wouldn't.
That would be great.
You kind of mentioned before, and you write in your article that some of those tools hinder deep learning of CSS, and I would agree. But I also know a handful of folks who would argue that that doesn't matter anymore because they don't need that deep learning because they have the tools. This kind of self-continuing problem.
That's fine.
I'm curious if you think that level of deep learning is still required or still necessary, or if you do think that that's something that can be outsourced, for lack of a better word, to some of those management tools.
Yeah, I mean, I have no beef against tools. I'm not a purist in any ways. I use frameworks and stuff in my I'm on a React project right now. Like, I'm not using like vanilla JavaScript for a lot of things. Like these, I think you said it before, like these are just tools in my tool belt. It's fine. I'm gonna pick and use whatever is gonna work for me. I think I wrote in my article that I think Tailwind's great for a lot of reasons. And I think when it comes to like I really need to like rapidly iterate and quickly prototype something up, or I just need to get something out the door and I want to have some like level of like good design on top of it. Like that's awesome. Use it. Like, and also like I don't necessarily think that Tailwind like hinders it. It's a crutch that some people use. It's sort of like the use case of it. Like I think if you really dug into Tailwind, you could learn a lot about CSS. Like there's a lot there. I think the paradigm with it is that it's, with a lot of these frameworks, especially when it comes to CSS, is they kind of put it within like, it's like API for CSS. Like it puts it in a perspective that a lot of developers understand, which is great. Like if that's like the way you learn, do it. That's fine. I don't care. Like that's the way that you're gonna learn. Like sometimes the best way to learn is like pick apart other people's code or frameworks or whatever. Like the problem I have with these tools, at least when it comes to CSS. So like when I see other tools like Vue and React and stuff like that, like I see them solving like specific problems. And like there's like so much written about like, like this is why I use TypeScript, because I would like strongly typed language. So I know like, I want to reduce the amount of errors, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of it, like I think when the conversation around CSS is like, I do not want to even touch CSS. It is awful. Just give me something that I don't have to look at. There's like no reasoning behind like, oh, this is like amazing. This is like why, I should use this. And I will say I have coworkers who have written some articles about specifically about that, about why Tailwind is awesome and why they use it and like going into the technical details. And that's great. Like you should read those articles. Like I guess like the issue I have is like it being a band-aid to every business's like CSS woes, and like that's how they market themselves. They abstract themselves enough so you don't have to think about it too hard. But oftentimes like it doesn't scale if you don't have people on your team that are just as invested in creating a system with these tools as any other designer. And I've seen like far too many implementations that are just like trash fire, like becomes spaghetti code. Like it's just like untenable. And it's more about like the fact that like they might not be using it in the way that it's intended. And that like no coding language is like that. Like any code language could become spaghetti.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And like, yeah.
I've seen
it's
it.
like, yeah. And but like I feel like a lot of these frameworks shield that from responsibility. It's like, well, I'm using this framework, so I don't really have to worry about it. Like I don't have to worry about this being accessible. I don't have to worry about like this, like incorporating this. Like, I don't know. And the other thing is like all these frameworks are always going to be catching up to the features that are like, being brought into like, these native languages like CSS. And so CSS is like, especially being like constantly being shunted into different systems that fit the mold that programmers are familiar with. CSS and JS, hot issue.
Yes.
So contentious. And we're like constantly trying to push CSS to like act like other languages and bending it in ways to fit our ideas about how it should work, which is like fine. If you want to like, futz around with that, go for it. But like, we don't like, there's not a lot about like, how can we learn more about CSS and figure out how to work it within the systems that we already have created? How can we like kind of like really empower people to, work with it like how it works right now instead of trying to like reinvent the wheel here? So that's my general thoughts and opinions on like why some of these frameworks are hindering some deep learning. It's not necessarily the frameworks themselves. It's just like the use case that I've seen across the board from people who are like all about it.
No, I think that's fair. And I also think make a really good point that I actually hadn't thought of is that when you're using something like that, you're not getting to use all the latest and greatest in like CSS,
Right.
Tailwind is great, but I'm sure it won't have support for layers as soon as they drop, know?
Yeah.
And so, you won't get to leverage that, which is a bummer. I think a lot of it kind of also ties back into that idea of women's work that we kicked around before, this feeling of like, oh, I shouldn't have to do that. Let me just do it my way. But, do something in between it so I don't have to deal with that stuff that's below me in a way.
Right.
Which, yeah. In the chat, that perspective is great until you need to fix a flat, so to speak, which is true. It's hard to go in and troubleshoot and bug solve when you don't know what you're solving around or solving for or working with.
I think that's why it's so important to like documentation is such like an important practice when it comes to like building up a code base and making sure that like, you're not going to be around on this project forever. You want to be able to hand it off to people and have them understand. So it's not only the user experience that you're designing around, it's the developer experience. And like, what does that look like? And how do people come to understand the code base, and like what rules and constraints are you putting in there? And how are you communicating that with your code? And so having it like a good place to work inside is going to like improve your scalability, your maintainability, your ability to onboard people really quickly.
I think that ties in actually really well with this next comment. Every middle or large size company will have created its own framework, its own processes for dealing with dev challenges, but abstraction creates lots of issues, which also true. I think that's part of what needs to be evaluated every time you choose to include a new tool in your application, in your code base. You're not just looking at the kind of quote unquote physical parts of that, like, oh, how big is the library, or how will this impact our build size, or how does this mess with the way our project builds, or how do we incorporate it? There's also how do we teach people, and who's in charge of maintaining this, and how often do we update? Are we always going to be on the newest version? Are there other dependencies that this will mess with?
Oh my God, like version bumping is such a thing. Like
there's so many places I've worked where they will put off updating until you're so far in the hole, and then it's a huge project.
I know.
But similarly, you can't always just go update each individual library because they depend on different things, or they have breaking changes, or every time you add something new, and it could be Tailwind or it could be any other library, any other framework, you add another abstraction over that HTML, CSS, JavaScript base that you can safely assume that any engineer you bring on will know those three. You can't safely assume they will all know every library.
Absolutely.
They're all probably capable of learning it. But then you got to factor that time in too, and that time is money.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like you need to treat like frameworks like you treat product decisions. They're a feature, not a requirement. And so how can we break this down? Like, what problem are we solving by introducing this? And like, how can we account for the scalability? What are some problems we might encounter? How might we QA this? Like, how might we make adjustments? And so basically, like, I think we start off with like, well, this project needs the X, Y, and Z to like run efficiently. And it's like, no, is that really the MVP? Can we pull that back a little bit to really it's like most simplest parts, and then layer on some of that complexity, because starting off with like a lot of that, like you end up like spending so much more time going back and like refactoring and adjusting, and it's just a mess.
Hope you like NPM, friend. Similarly, this will be the refactor. Everything. I also did not fully clock username the first time. Merely okay Pyrenees, which is honestly so good. Oh man. But sorry, I'm still recovering from merely okay Pyrenees.
It's so good. I love it.
I believe that is
oops, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay,
please.
now I'm back. Now I'm back to my my audio just dropped, but now it's back.
Oh, okay, cool. We're here. You can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Kind of similarly, earlier we were talking about the way the back end is kind of been creeping into the front end. some people are kind of starting to argue that those terms themselves, front end and back end, are getting a little bit outdated, and it's all just kind of becoming development now.
Yeah.
which seems both true and terrifying to me personally. If that could hold off until like the next generation, that'd be great. It won't, but it'd be nice.
It would be great. Yeah. Just like coast for a little while. That'd be awesome.
That would be cool. But yeah, do you think that kind of shift would ultimately be helpful for the way that CSS is seen, kind of letting it all be in one bucket? There's no more like front end work versus back end work. Or do you think that would contribute more to that kind of erasure of CSS that we're seeing a little bit now?
I mean, I'm all for more crossover. I love crossover. It's great. Like, I think the more people that can learn about like the full development spectrum of the web, the better. Like, that's great. Like, even with engineers learning more about like the opposite side, people like are still going to have their specialties. It's just like how humans work.
Right.
You know, probably because like certain types of problems or ways of writing code are more interesting to them, and like the same goes with CSS. I don't see a problem with working primarily in Python, but you also happen to know how to write really good CSS. Like, that's really cool. That's
a nice combination.
skill set to have, and like that would be amazing. Like, I think the idea here is that if you are full stack or even just front end, like CSS and HTML just need to be a part of that, and they need to be a part of like what you learn in your courses to become a developer. They need to be part of the criteria you have to getting promoted at work as like whatever developer in that area. Like CSS, I mean, CSS isn't like a cool party trick or black magic or whatever. Like, it's an actual technical skill that requires like deep learning and just like needs to be treated as such. So like, yeah, more people should learn CSS, and it should be like more of like a crossover. But like, I guess like the one worry might be like that, like we're just going to try and abstract CSS out of like needing to know it, but
just out of existence entirely.
I know, but I see it as a good thing. Like, I think one of the things I tried to push for is developers who design and designers who develop, and like the more that we can have that crossover, I think the better.
Yes. I'm personally struggling because I fully agree with all of that, and I'm also big on banging the drum of designers who develop, developers who design. And then when I turn that around, it's like, oh, but I should learn backend stuff.
No,
I don't think so. I don't think it's for me.
And I think that's fine.
I'm joking.
I mean, like, I think like it's fine to have like specialties and to want to focus in a certain area. And if you want to like stay in like a certain spot of like the languages that you like do it. Like, that's fine. But I basically just want to lower that barrier of like, if you are doing backend, then you don't need to know about CSS, or you shouldn't even bother learning it. Like, if you have like some kind of interest in it, or you want to like poke around in it, like, do it. Please do. Please, more people should learn this.
No, in all seriousness, I think we hear about that like T model of learning. I don't know if you ever heard that expression where they talk about, you know, broad and deep.
Yep.
I think the more we can broaden, the better our eventual user experience becomes, right? When everyone has at least a high level of understanding of every part of the application, they all make choices that are beneficial to everyone. It's okay, though, for your deep learning section to be somewhere else.
Well, yeah, and I think like, you know, that comes across when like, you know, you're not necessarily like responsible for implementing everything when you like have like a general understanding, but like you might be responsible for communicating some of those needs and like knowing some of the constraints of the languages, or knowing how some of the languages operate and can solve your problems. I think is really important when it comes to collaborating and working on a team. Knowing what other people know and knowing who to go to for answers about how to implement something is great. So if you have some kind of base knowledge of some of these technologies, like, that's awesome. Great. Like, do more. That's awesome. Like, even if you're not a developer designer, if you're working in like marketing, or if you work like within like a technological company, like learning more about that is like amazing, and like it like really bridges a lot of those communication gaps.
It is so nice to work with product people who have even a high level understanding of the development process. It changes the whole game.
Right.
I'm sure it would feel the same way in reverse. Like, I'm sure everyone kind of benefits from that two-way street.
Yeah. And I think like, you know, it promotes like empathy for other people, like knowing how generally like how their job works and what goes into it. Like, it's great. Because you can also like, you can uh, promote other people into like, these are like, you should ask this person because I know that they work in this code, and like, basically giving people a lot more pathways to find out more information about how things work and what might be like the best route to go down for like a certain product decision. I think it's great.
Some good, or maybe just some opinions.
Just learn that. I love Netlify. I think it's great.
Just learn Netlify. This has been, it seems so polarizing. I have not personally worked with Netlify at all. Awesome. But I either hear like, just learn it, it's amazing, or like, of course it's broken, it's because you use Netlify. And there seems to be no in between. And I am committed to remaining completely neutral on this by learning nothing about it at all.
Yeah. I think if you work in like the Jamstack space, like it's amazing. It's so good. I use it for a lot of my projects, personal projects, because it makes it like so much easier to like launch a project. And I love it.
Interesting.
10 out of 10.
Yeah. Recently finished my first dev side project on both the back end and the front end as a designer. Node makes back end stuff easier for sure, but I had no idea how complex it is, and I never want to touch it again.
Totally
this is
fair.
Such a mood.
Yep.
I did one of these semi-recently where I was like, ooh, I have an idea and I want to build it, but I'm just a designer and a front-end developer, so I need something for the back end. I used Firebase. Similarly in this idea of just like, I don't want to touch this. And so I feel that pain.
Yeah, it is pain, but like, at least you tried it and you kind of dove into it. That's great. But yeah, I think that also comes back to like our pairing like commentary about like, like a lot of these like languages like might be somewhat like palatable to a lot of people if they're learning alongside someone else, or if they're like, because I think there's a difference between knowing how to implement it and knowing why something works, and like what the pros and cons of it are, and like why you would make certain choices around certain technologies or certain like use cases for it. I think that has always been sort of the turning point for me, and wanting to learn more stuff is like knowing why would I use this, like what situations is this good for, and digging deeper into that I think is really, really fun.
I think that kind of marks that shift from like beginner to intermediate knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? Beginner is like, it works, I wrote the code and it does the thing, like I'm gonna walk away slowly now. Yeah. Whereas once you get to that more intermediate level, you're like, okay, this is how it works, and I could probably clean it up by removing this, and I could probably, it would make more sense if I architected it like this. And
exactly.
Once you start thinking beyond like, all the pieces are in and it's functional, like you get to that deeper understanding that makes it more interesting, honestly, than what can just feel like a fight for your freaking life in the beginning stage.
Yep. Absolutely.
Oh boy. Circling back though, actually on your blog, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about that idea of like the perception of CSS as feminine. And I think part of why when I read that blog, I was really affected by it was because I saw a bunch of my own experiences kind of reflected in that, especially while I was in the process of kind of transitioning my career from being design focused to development focus. CSS still seemed like it was on the design side a little bit, and that didn't feel like what I wanted because I was so busy establishing myself as like a real developer, like heavy air quotes on that. But at the time that felt so important for people to look at me and think, she's an engineer, like she's a developer and not just a designer. Because I was worried of being kind of stuck in that space. And as it ended up, I liked that space. And so I got myself unstuck and was like, oh no, actually that was really cool. I'd love to be in the middle again. But at the time I was really worried about that perception. And I think a lot of that was because of the way CSS is perceived and kind of dismissed as like being just design or just CSS or just making things pretty. It took a really long time for me to start seeing those skill sets as valuable and not something that was being downplayed. I'm curious whether you had a similar experience as someone else who kind of made that shift, or if you've kind of had that, just, talking with other people have had that kind of feeling.
Yeah, I hesitated to call myself a developer for a really long time. Like I was like, even though I was like the go-to person when it came to like front end at a lot of my jobs, like I struggled what to call myself so I could point out that like I'm a designer, but I code. Just so
Yeah.
you know, like
My
it just
LinkedIn is just a mess of titles where I'm like, this, I guess.
yeah, like how do I describe this? I don't know. Like it just didn't feel legitimate as legitimate as what my engineer coworkers were doing. And it
Yeah.
also felt weird since I came from a print background and learned how to code along the way. And
Yes.
they were all like CS graduates. And like this was earlier in my career where like boot camps and like other paths to becoming a developer weren't as common. And I felt like I was there just to put like the finishing touches on their projects. Like I wasn't like an integral part of that process. Like engineer makes the thing and I threw some styling on it and that was my job. And I wasn't a part of a lot of the decision making when it came to code. But as I got deeper into product work, and then moved to a place where as part of those conversations from like kickoff all the way to launch, I understood the value of my skill set. And you know what? It's like really cool to straddle both design and code to help someone visualize an idea and create a prototype and make it beautiful and then implement it. Like that's amazing. That's so fun. I love it. And I think it's super valuable.
It really is. And I think it's one of those things. I have also worked at places that didn't have that didn't have a designer. I've jumped around between a couple of startups at this point, and a lot of times that doesn't tend to be the priority when they're in that like really early startup-y phase. And so a lot of times I would get brought in as like, oh, we just realized that our user experience is terrible and we might need a designer. But also we're a startup and we can't afford just a designer, so you'll need to do development work as well.
Cool,
There are
cool, cool.
a lot of those jobs. And there's that kind of feeling where it's like, oh, we need you to do the development work, but also if you could make it not look atrocious, that would be nice. And it was like, oh, well, that doesn't feel good. You know? But I think the other truth is a lot of those places are hiring designers because they realized they've gotten as far as they can get without thinking about their users, frankly.
Yep, 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 yep. They're like, oh, wow. Maybe this would be beneficial.
Right. As it turns out, just making it work was not enough.
Yep, 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 yep.
But it's really, I find it really interesting to kind of see that shift in, I guess, just me and other people that I've worked with, that kind of realization of like, no, this is valuable and it's not dismissible work and it's not last minute work and it's right, it's not come back for a second round and put the finishing touches on work.
Yeah.
It's actually MVP.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I think like it helps to also like demystify and like lower that veil of like what development work actually is, like seeing some of my coworkers work and be like, okay, like I understand sort of like what goes into this. And like, you know, having that base understanding, I think is really important to sort of like understanding your own value in the process. But I think there is like this idea of like, oh, this is like amazingly like difficult work and hard. And it's like, yeah, like you can learn it. I promise you can all learn it. Like I get a lot of questions from people like who are breaking into development or like, oh, do I have to be good at math? And I'm like, no.
That put me off forever. Is literally, yep. That was a huge part of why I didn't pursue it in college, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm not a strong math student to this day. At 30 something, I don't think I get to call myself a student anymore. but I was never good at math. And when talking to people and when getting advice from like, you know, high school counselors and parents and adults in my life, they pushed me away from that field strongly. Even though at that point I was coding. I was coding my own websites and I was coding MySpace and I was coding on live demo, and that wasn't, that math barrier was seen as too large.
Yeah. Well, I think because it falls into like computer science, especially falls into like that STEM camp of like, well, there's like sort of like that gender barrier there. And it's like, well, this is only for men. And then we're, you know, gender minoritized people are sort of socialized, like, you know, especially the feminine identifying people like from early on that like, you know, well, this is whether it's obvious or not, but that it's like a very masculine thing. It's for men. And It's going to be male dominated, and it's going to be hard because there's like a lot of men in it. There's just like a lot of barriers that are sort of like set in place from day one that like prevent a lot of people from getting into web development and engineering. And like little to no, it's like so cool and it's so awesome, and they can do it. Like literally anyone can do it.
Anyone can do it. I wish there had been more women that I could have seen when I was that age and making career choices.
Yeah.
Because I was getting strongly directed towards design. And again, that all worked out. I don't have like, grudges or bad feelings or resentment about going into design. But I remember being at that age and trying to choose. And it feels crazy now to look back and be like, no, like you were doing it, girl. Like you were coding.
Yeah.
and somehow got talked out of it.
Yeah.
Like, I wish there had been someone that I could have been like, oh yeah, I knew, a friend or an aunt or a teacher or someone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's like, it's just like another example where like representation is so critical when it comes to like getting more people into code. Like like having more like women, gender minoritized people in leadership roles, having more Black women, having more Indigenous women, having more people color in leadership roles that are evangelizing like these pathways, and also providing a bunch of different pathways for people. Like, you don't have to go to get a CS degree to do a lot of this work. Like you can do a boot camp, you can like learn along the way. Like as long as you're good at it, like people are going to hire you. And like how do we create these pathways for people while also sort of like cutting down a lot of these like barriers that are popping up along the way?
Yes. And I think also emphasizing just the range of available options within this field.
Yeah.
Right? I think there's a huge perception of engineers still as like one dude alone in a dark room, like hacking or something.
Sometimes it is.
Sometimes it is. But it's not just that. I think we saw a little bit of that in some of the comments earlier about pairing, about this emphasis of feeling like they needed to do it alone exclusively. And to be able to kind of recast programming as the community skill that it is, is important. I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people are in a dark room.
I don't get good light in my room. I have like this like ring light, but it's like so bad.
Yeah, I don't think it's so bad. And also, you're not in a dark room. I don't see a single like. There's so many like stereotypes we could lean into. I don't see a single bottle of Mountain Dew or a bag of Doritos. Or
you can't see below to my desk. It's bad.
You've got it all there. And
this is one of like 5 cups on my desk. I collect cups.
Oh, same. Oh, absolutely same. But one last thing, we are getting kind of close to the end of our time together, which reminds me, if anyone has any questions, now's your time. Throw them in the chat. We're happy to talk about anything and everything. But I had a couple last questions that I want to talk about because I'm selfish. Sure. But one of the things that I really loved in your article was that you specifically noted that CSS being feminine isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think we've talked a lot thus far about kind of some of the negative implications around like women's work and gatekeeping.
Yeah.
But also, it doesn't necessarily need to be an insult. I think a lot of times when we talk about femininity, especially in such a male-oriented workplace, it doesn't come across as a compliment.
Right.
But I'm curious if you could expand a little on some of the ways that you think femininity is good, is beneficial for CSS.
Yeah, if you talk about like femininity, like we can get in a whole like gender discussion. But like
we can have a whole gender discussion.
I think a lot about how our idea of neutrality is often like through the lens of masculinity. Like, when you think about like gender neutral clothing, it's often masculine. Like you don't think of like, tutus and pink as being neutral. And the idea that like many feminine identifying people or socialized people like tend to use a lot of exclamation points or emojis in our email comms. And they were like, I remember there was a year there were so many articles written about how like you got to stop doing that and then be more direct and more professional. And like I now I go through my emails and like I take out all the exclamation points that I use because I feel bad about it. And like, why? Like, why are we stressing ourselves out trying to inject like emotion when we should like be taking like the more dramatic? Like, why is that the approach that we should take? And like being told that it's empowering to do it that way. And maybe it is for some, but like, why can't we err on the side of femininity and instead of directness and briefness, everyone takes on the emotional labor of communication and more people put exclamation points in their emails. And I just want to not feel bad about it. You're like, all this to say, like, I think there's a level of empathy in femininity and the community has felt safer, more welcoming than other languages. And that doesn't to say that it's been without issues. Like we're in tech after all. And we talked about that state of CSS survey showing that we're surfacing a lot of what's vocalized from like white dudes.
Yeah.
But still to see like a lot more gender minoritized folks as well-known figures in this space is like really inspiring and really awesome. And I love it. And I think more languages need more femininity in it.
Yes. I love that you brought up the emails and the exclamation points. Not only do I also do that, but have also kind of gone through that same shift where it's like, oh, I need to not do that. Like I need to take unnecessary words out and remove the just or, whatever. I was just thinking or, whatever. But then I actually read an article recently that was talking about how that actually it is more empathetic and it is a better way of communicating when you're not kind of structuring opinions as facts, and you're not hiding emotion. That tone comes across a lot clearer when people write in that way. It's something that we have been told to shift. I think, at least for me, the entirety of my professional working career, I've been told to write less like me and more like men, frankly. Yeah. And we're finding now that that's not necessarily the most effective form of communication. It's just the standard. Yeah. That doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's nuance to that. There's definitely this is, our idea of what feminine and masculine is probably colored by our environment and our Western ideals when there's sort of a lot of cross-cultural nuance that goes into communication. But I think the idea there of that very direct approach isn't necessarily the right one. I think is what we're sort of hedging at when we talk about injecting more femininity into that.
Right. I mean, I would say in general, it's not necessarily that we're saying everyone needs to write exactly like this.
Right.
Lots of exclamation points and emojis and qualifiers or whatever. It's more that everyone should feel free to communicate in the way that makes the most sense to them. And there should be a level of thought and consideration that goes into it that's more than just the kind of tone policing that kind of happens now when some people write. And that when it comes across as weak or feminine in ways that don't necessarily apply. There's strength in femininity as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's end on a lighter note. We got pretty deep today, honestly. And I'm glad we had that conversation. I think it's a necessary one.
It was awesome.
But that being said, we did already touch on the fact that 2022 is looking like a big year for CSS. CSS is moving forward at light speed, frankly. So things are changing constantly. P3 colors, subgrid, cascade layers, there's a lot on the horizon. I'm curious if there is a particular bit of CSS that you are most excited about.
I mean, all of the things. I think we talked about this before, but definitely cascade layers. I just watched a video Una Kravitz had put out, and I'm really excited about it. Also, the has selector. I really love that we're getting into space with CSS where we have more control over specificity. It's really exciting. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff, and I can't wait to use it all. And I'm also going to be oh my god, I can't even possibly learn all these things all at once. Which is why let's get back to our early conversation about you should put out what you're learning and put it out in the open and let other people learn from you because it's great.
Yep. Everyone, anytime you try anything new with CSS, y'all, write it up.
Yeah. Love to learn from other people.
Moving so quick. And especially
So
with
awesome.
CSS, which we kind of talked on earlier, a lot of people aren't up to date. There's still a lot of assumptions about how CSS works, and a lot of those assumptions are 5 to 10 years old. So try out that
You
new
don't
stuff.
have to use floats anymore.
Oh my god. I literally never use floats anymore.
Yeah.
I can't remember the last time I used a float. And
I think
thankfully
I used them a little bit, like when I was doing like editorial design stuff, because I needed to like throw in some like images and have like the things wrap. But like that was like my only use case. Everything else was like, why am I even dealing with this?
We don't have to use them for like structure in the same way.
I know, yeah, now. That's so great.
I was like that shift away from tables for layout into tables for just data. Like, my god, that was a dark era.
I know. Like I like the idea of like, you know, everything sort of has its place, and like we're keeping tables semantic with just like data.
Yeah, there's a situation of whatever design bringing on innovation. I'm trying to remember how it was phrased earlier.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about innovation, we can talk about the ways in which CSS has been used to achieve things that it was not meant to do.
Exactly. Someone wrote in the chat, float was a calamity, not plummet feminine.
Not
hard to agree.
I love this, like, not a vibe.
Definitely not a vibe.
Oh man. But yeah, I think that's just about our time for today. If people want to follow you or are interested in more of your writing or thoughts, Elaina, where can they find you?
I'm on Twitter, Elaina Natario. I don't tweet often, I'll be honest. But if I do write something, I do like a lot of retweeting. So if you want like things surfaced up in your feed that I'm reading, that's your place to do it.
That's valuable. That's good. I don't have to read all the things. I'll wait for you to read them and then tell me.
Exactly. I'll curate it for you. So
honestly, ideal. That's really what I want out of Twitter. And of course, invite Elaina more often. I would love to, actually, genuinely.
This was fun.
We had a great time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys all for tuning in. We will be back next week with you on Mondays, same time, same channel, 2 p.m. I'm trying to remember what the topic is, and I don't. You'll just have to come back and be surprised.
It's a mystery.
It's a mystery. The Kendo team will tweet about it. I'll find out next week. All right, guys. I will catch you later. Have a good week. Hope this was a good Monday. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.